Morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Trang, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's Refinitiv Perspectives live stream. As the UN General Assembly is underway, the first in a completely virtual format with a couple of very ambitious announcements by governments, we also wanted to dedicate an episode to discussing the progress of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, and what it will take to advance sustainable development post-COVID-19. The short-term environmental and social benefits of the coronavirus are undeniable. A drop in carbon emissions, improved air quality, sightings of rare wildlife species, and a surge in social impact bonds as demand for instruments to finance social projects such as housing, education, or healthcare have increased with the coronavirus. The long-term impact of the pandemic, however, remains uncertain. The ensuing global economic crisis, rising unemployment, and the devastating impact of vulnerable communities have undoubtedly set back efforts to advance the SDGs, especially in developing countries. The SDGs provide such a robust blueprint to create a more sustainable future for all and to tackle some of the most pressing global challenges, including poverty, hunger, inequalities, climate change, or lack of peace and justice. But to be able to meet their looming 2030 deadline will require the SDGs to be placed at the core of COVID-19 recovery efforts and long-term plans to create more resilient and sustainable societies. So loads to discuss, and I encourage everyone, as always, to ask any questions you might have in the chat. I will try to answer as many as possible. And I'm really excited to introduce our speakers for today. Esther, Chief Sustainability Officer for real estate firm CDL and a long-standing champion of sustainable development. Guillaume Lafortune, Senior Economist of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, a UN initiative to mobilize technical and scientific expertise to advance the SDGs. And last but not least, Julia Walker, Global Head of Government and Industry Affairs for Refinitiv, and one of the key driving forces behind the Future of Sustainable Data Alliance, an industry group advancing ESG data and technology. Thanks to all of you for joining us here today.
Thanks, Trang.
So I guess to just kick off the conversation, I wanted to start with a question that I think have crossed many people's minds. How do you think COVID-19 has impacted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the progress of the SDGs? Perhaps we could start with you, Esther.
Oh, okay. Yeah, in fact, I think a silver lining, of COVID, in fact, it has accelerated, ESG adoption, not just by corporate, it's also by investors, and even insurers and bankers, financial. And all these different sectors, are all intertwined in the business world. As a business, we need to, communicate with investors, especially we are listed company, institutional investors' view of our ESG performance or SDG integration is very important. So how do we do that? We have to communicate. And when we communicate, we also need a common language, which actually SDG, really fall into this category, provide a very good common ground and common understanding of what we are communicating. The 17 goals, 169 targets. And for CDL, we build home, we build office space, and we are also a hotel and owner and operator. We are operating in 29 countries and regions. So we need really a common language that can connect us with the world. So this is something that's why we have embraced SDG since 2016, starting from like 9 goals, and today we have actually embraced 14 out of 17 goals, but not the more the merrier. We select goals that we really can add value to our core business, and more importantly, whether it is material to our business and whether we can really make an impact. No point to just tick boxes, and in the end of the day, there's no alignment, there's no impact that we can really create. So of course, that has already included in our sustainability report since 2016. We actually, apart from the sustainability reporting, we also offer quarterly reporting, share the key strategic goals of our ESG goals that has been aligned with the climate action and the 2030 goals, and that has actually, we have started doing so by in 2017, so that investors and analysts and the media are very clear of the direction of our company, and sustainability blueprints that we established in 2017 lay down very clearly what are our long-term goals, what including like reducing carbon footprint, including energy with reduction reduction, and water management and waste management, and of course health and safety. So all these are actually posted on our online anytime, that we will just update it. And because we do believe that communication is key in today's world, whether it is investors or potential partners or consumers who are getting more and more vocal with and raising their bar as well for responsible consumption and production. Yeah, so I think I better stop at this point. I will continue later on in other questions. Yeah, thank you.
Anything to add? I don't know, Guillaume?
Sure. So let me take maybe a more macro approach to the question that you were asking on how COVID-19 has impacted the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think overall COVID-19 is a major setback for the Sustainable Development Goals. I think this is clear, and there are immediate impacts that are very tangible. And let me just name a few. I mean, if we look at SDG 1 on no poverty, we're speaking for 2020 about 71 million more people into extreme poverty. On SDG 2, no hunger, we're speaking about 130 million people more into chronic hunger by the end of the year. SDG 3, obviously, there's the death toll of COVID-19, which is now nearing about 1 million people. But then there's also a secondary health crisis, right? COVID has disrupted the supply and demand for health services. So there's additional tuberculosis, HIV, under 5 mortality that is happening also in many parts of the world. On SDG 4, education, about 24 million additional children may drop out or not have access to school by 2021. And then I won't go into the details of the economic impact. So SDG 8 on economic growth, where we're obviously having a global recession, huge impacts on jobs, employment, but also sharp decline in remittance income, which is obviously a significant source of revenues in many parts of the world. So these are very immediate, straightforward impacts that we are seeing. When we look at the medium and the longer run, obviously there's still a lot of uncertainties on how we are going to bounce back from this. And I see 3 major ones which might affect the overall impact of COVID-19, not only in the short run, but in the longer run. The first one is, how are countries going to implement the public health measures that are needed to suppress this virus? I think this remains the priority for every country at the moment. And as I always say these days, public health is probably the most important macroeconomic tool at the moment. The second one is, when are we going to have treatments and vaccines, and how fast are we going to be able to scale this up when this will be available to the entire world? And I think this whole idea that we see spreading about vaccinalism and is actually a very dangerous one. And one thing we should ensure is once we have treatment and vaccine is that this is spread in a fair and equal way throughout the world. And the last point is, how sustainable are going to be the recovery plans and the investments, right? And here, I think the picture right now that we see is mixed. There's obviously good intentions, but we also saw, and I think here the OECD Economic Outlook last week had a very good chart. We also see that a lot of the policy support goes to the fossil fuel industry with no climate targets at the moment, right? This is a significant subsidies that are going through fossil fuel industry at the moment. And this is obviously not aligned to the achievement of the SDGs and Agenda 2030. On the good side, I mean, we've seen yesterday the announcement of China and wanting to aim for carbon neutrality by 2060. I think this is very ambitious, very promising. Europe has obviously made a claim a few months ago with the European Green Deal and wanting to be climate neutral by 2050. So I think this is all providing, in theory, very good foundations, and it sets the directions for new forms of public and private partnerships, but also for sustainable investment in order to implement these objectives. So I think this is a little bit where we are standing right now. Immediate negative impacts on the SDGs and sustainable development, and whether these will have medium and long-term negative impacts on the SDGs really depends on the leadership and the response that governments put forward.
So Trang, it's interesting. This time last year, I was at the UN General Assembly. So to start with, that's quite significant. And last year we had Greta. We'd had a whole year of a lot of climate action, and there was a lot of positivity, even though we weren't on track. Every country is off track to achieve the SDGs. There's a lot of optimism and hope. A lot more messages on how we need to use the private sector, and particularly the finance sector, to achieve the SDGs. And so I think also coming out of COVID, what we're seeing is a stronger response. So last year, I also had the pleasure to launch my book, which was on the SDGs, how we can achieve the SDGs through finance, technology, and law reform. And we're now seeing a lot of the case studies that we put forward, going into action. It's interesting to see the policy response. And so last year, from governments, I don't think it was as strong. That is a financial risk, and that is firmly on the agenda. So the network for greening the financial system, there's been a lot more countries and prudential authorities joining that, and they're super clear. And we just produced a report on Monday, which is the role of data and sustainable investment policy and regulation, which actually interviewed 30 different policymakers and investors going, what do you see here? So one, it's pretty unanimous. And how could you not see that climate risk is a financial risk? COVID is our first ESG crisis. There's going to be more to come. We have to be starting to integrate environmental and social factors into the financial system. Coming out of that, we need the green stimulus. So we also have an unprecedented opportunity. All this money is coming out. So one, we have a health crisis. We need to keep companies solvent. So a lot of money pumping into the financial system. But now it's looking on what green strings can we attach to these. I'd hope a lot more, but there've been some really good examples in the airline industry in that bailouts to some of these companies have these green strings attached and sort of, carbon conditions. So there is an opportunity. It's not looking good. As Guillaume's saying, we're wildly off track. We were wildly off track beforehand. But if anything, now is the time to more firmly integrate environmental and social risks into our investments, into our financial system.
Thanks, everyone. The statistics are pretty depressing, but I think, like you all mentioned, there's room for improvement and a ton of plans in place. And what I wanted to pick up in my next question is really what you mentioned, Julia, around the role of the private sector and the role of the financial sector in specifics. I think the financing gap for achieving the SDGs is estimated at a hopping 2.5 to 3 trillion US dollars in developing countries. And it's something that I think has continued to widen now with COVID-19. So what do you all think? How can we tackle this funding gap? Maybe Guillaume first, you, and then everyone else can add to it.
Sure. I think one of the points we're making, and this came out from the high-level political forum in July, where we were obviously in the midst of the crisis, and some called for possibly reducing ambition when it comes to the SDGs or rethinking a little bit those goals. Some even called for maybe putting back leaders at the negotiation table, which I think is not the right call here. I think this is not a moment to actually reduce ambition, but it's actually a moment to transform our societies and to target a little bit more the type of changes that we want to see. So what we are saying, us in SDSN, is that on one hand, the goals are technically achievable. So there's nothing technically that prevents us from putting every kid from 5 to 15 into schools. There's nothing that prevents us from achieving climate neutrality by mid-century, and so on and so forth, right? The same applies to the healthcare goals, where there's a lot of studies that show that we can achieve major breakthroughs on addressing lots of the basic access to healthcare. So technically, there's no gap here. Financially also, and I think these are estimates that both SDSN and the IMF have put forward, it's also affordable, right? So we're speaking about approximately 2% of GDP to achieve these goals by 2030. These were estimates that were put forward before COVID-19. the cost might have increased a little bit, but it's still within range. Obviously, as you said, Trang, some developing countries and low-income countries require additional financial support. This is for sure, and I think here there's obviously many instruments that can be leveraged, official development assistance, of course. And I mean, I think with COVID, there is obviously a risk that countries might be tempted to reduce their contribution. And again, very few countries from the official development assistance committee have achieved the 0.7% target dedicated to ODA. So I think it's always good to remind ourselves that very few countries have achieved this target. Then there's obviously the question of debt relief and debt restructuring. So here, obviously, key role for the IMF, the G20. Obviously, continuous effort for strengthening capacities for domestic resource mobilization. But I think there's also a whole question on new taxes and financing mechanisms, right, and instruments that could be leveraged here. And not to go too much into the details, but I think here the questions around digital taxation, green bonds, but also we see now the rise of SDG bonds in certain countries. I think these are all very interesting instruments. And then a final point, I mean, there's the resources, obviously, that you can leverage, but there's also, in terms of the spending, efficiency gains, right? So we see that the cost of renewables are also dropping. And we see also that, you know, by rolling out digital technologies, we can also reduce drastically the costs for access to key services, including health and education.
Trang, I'll jump in there. I mean, it's interesting. So first, before the crisis and now, we have enough money to achieve the SDGs. And so, as Guillaume's saying, it's feasible. It's just how we channel it. And that's where the role of the private system comes in, and finance. So if you look at pension funds, you know, how much money they hold, what are they investing in? How do they channel that? You know, what are asset managers and real money managers doing? Because they invest for long term. And so you mentioned sort of the infrastructure gap, which is about 5 to 7 trillion. If that was getting put into investment that was sort of green, you know, the renewables, but, you know, even schools, roads, things that won't cause big carbon locks, you know, sort of, you know, bad type of investments that will lock us into, you know, a carbon deep pathway for the next 30 years, that takes us on the right path. And just coming back to the integration of environmental factors, and we have to move from our model, you know, the traditional methods of looking and analyzing stock just won't fly. I mean, we can see that coming through from regulation and policy. Economic theories of yesterday don't really hold true. You have to integrate environmental risks, but more so opportunities into the long term. And so a lot of investors have already been using ESG strategies, right? So we had about 23 trillion of assets under management in 2016. That's now at 40 trillion. So a third of assets under management have an ESG sort of strategy attached to it. The next phase of this is going to be impact. And this is where the SDGs are quite important, because they provide us with a framework of impact. You know, how do we align it to climate action? How do we align it to gender equality? How do we align it to themes that matter to us? Everyone will have different things that they care about, but they do enable us a framework, and then we can look back. So at Refinitiv, we've actually mapped all of our ESG indicators to the SDGs. And so someone can actually look at that. Now, the SDGs were sort of built for government, but there's 40% of them that directly align to GRI disclosures. So 93 indicators, you know, that's huge. The problem is, in 2015, you had 85% or 95% of companies saying, we're going to align our investment to the SDGs. And, you know, very bullish. The stats now is that sort of around maybe 20-30% have actually done it. So there's been a real challenge. That challenge has come down to data in many ways. But that conversation has moved on. It can't be we don't have the data. We do have the data, but and then if you don't have the data, what data do you need? And that's one of the things that we, I guess, hit head on in January. So in Davos, we launched the Future of Sustainable Data Alliance, and it was to answer that question where, you know, it's not okay to say if we only had data, we would do more. Well, what data do you need? So we've been looking at that very deeply. We've been looking at spatial finance. So, you know, how do you go beyond disclosures and start looking at geospatial data and link that with asset level data? we've also been looking very heavily at factors that haven't been well explored. So the TCFD made great progress on sort of carbon and climate, and very pleased and a call out for New Zealand, being the first country that will mandate climate risk disclosure. More countries will follow. But what about biodiversity? So we know that biodiversity is a huge existential threat. Our food systems can collapse. So there's a task force of nature-related financial disclosures that's been, well, it was formally launched last year, but we're sort of already in flight on that one to go, well, how do you integrate biodiversity and nature-based capital into the financial system? That will happen, and so some of these hurdles will go away. I think more asset managers, investors need to do more today because there's a lot that they can do with the information that they have.
Yeah.
Thanks, Julia. And I think you actually gave an answer to my next question around data gaps and I think lags in the data actually provided in terms of monitoring SDGs, which has been cited, I think, many times as a key challenge to monitoring the progress of the development agenda. And I actually wanted to ask you, Esther, as someone who's been reporting on the SDGs and your sustainability efforts for the longest time, do you still see this as a big challenge, data gaps, and what are your future data requirements as a private sector player?
Well, I mean, I heard what Gil was sharing, that it is actually quite depressing in some of the SDG, but I want to really take a very positive outlook, from the business perspective. But of course, as a developer, as a building owner, I can't say that I can guarantee, people have food on the table and, everybody, there's no poverty and all that. But I think businesses can really drive change in certain areas, especially related to climate action, innovation, infrastructure, and even financing, and how to move the capital, to area that, SDG can really thrive and grow and improve the quality of life of, the emerging economy. So I think for businesses, definitely we look at how we can collaborate, whether with the regulators, with the financier, the investors, and also other private sector along our value chain. So in Singapore, actually, apart from supporting, the global goals of Paris agreements and all that, we also just rename our ministry for the environment to Ministry of Sustainability, and it set very interesting, very encouraging long-term and short-term goal to really align with sustainable development, and also look at the various expanding from just environmental sustainability to, social and financial, sustainability, and taking care of the people, taking a long-term view, and not just about clean and green, but a broader perspective of sustainability. So this is point one with the government alignment. And, we were also very happy to be one of the first batch of 87 company last year. I think, Julie, we probably didn't meet each other at the UN Climate Action, General Assembly there. We actually pledged support of the 1.5 degree business ambition. And that actually helped us to push forward our agenda even in a more aggressive manner, apart from, getting the SBTI validated reduction target in 2018. All these actually help to push businesses and our value chain to come together. How do we reduce, advancing net zero target in the long run? And how do we reduce the, the carbon footprint in the short run, whether it is like, scope 1, scope 2, and even embodied carbon, engaging supply chains to educate and engage them to look at sustainable building materials and, how to reduce embodied carbon. And TCFD is very, very important. We look at investors look at long term. We understand that as business, we also look at long term. So we have actually completed 2 rounds of climate change scenario planning. The first one in 2018 based on 2 degree, 4 degree. After the IPCC report, we just throw away the 4 degree scenario. We just look at 2 degree and 1.5 degree. What will be the likely impact on our financials? Looking at the physical and also transitional, and what is a likely cause of inaction. I mean, we have heard all those like, BlackRock has already put, 240 over company on watch list, and also punished some of the 50 over company through voting right. So, I mean, from my humble experience of walking this journey for 2 decades, I think it is not an exaggeration to say that ESG is really mainstream now, and we can't, just take it as like it's good to have, but really a mainstream business agenda, and look at how we can, tackle current problem and also future-proof our, business model to be more resilient, to counter unprecedented or uncertainty, like what COVID has actually taught us, that things can change overnight. How we live, work, and play can be just changed, over the past, over just 1-2 months with very short lead time. So in order for business to survive, you have to be resilient. And how to be resilient? ESG, SDG embracement is integration help us to enhance the business resilience in the long term. Yeah.
Thank you, Esther. Resilience and sustainability definitely go hand in hand for businesses. And I think we discussed a lot around the role of the private sector and companies and great examples. But I also wanted to touch on the role of policy and regulators. And I think this is something that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, Julia. So I wanted to direct the next question to you around really the role of regulatory frameworks and what is there to be improved in this space.
Thanks, Trang. I mean, it's a big piece. So with the SDGs and Paris Climate Agreement have been really important to actually start building the framework to get policy in place. And the most advanced is the EU and the European Commission's Green Action Plan that has 10 points to really reorientate the financial system towards sustainable development. And then we've seen a lot of other countries sort of coming and stepping in, doing it. Around Asia, Singapore sort of started last year. You've got, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, China, Japan, Australia. They're all sort of stepping up on this one. And it's really interesting to watch this unfold. But Asia's a bit behind, but they're very good at, catching up. So there's different aspects. So one is regulation for disclosures. So most disclosures in different countries have been voluntary. So quite frankly, they're all over the place. There's gaps. And when people say there's data gaps, because there's no sort of regulation to enforce disclosures, that's going to change. So once again, I do think Europe's sort of leading the way. They did a consultation this year, NFRD, the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, and you can sort of see that they're moving from sort of best practice and voluntary to mandatory and standardized. The International Business Council, sort of, which has been spearheaded by Barclays, has been working with the World Economic Forum to produce a set of metrics that they think every company in the world could align to, 10. And that's getting published, I think, tomorrow. They've actually come to all our data providers and sort of said, could you align to all these? And yes, we can. There's a lot more of this happening. So I think on the regulation on disclosure side, we will see movement. And Esther mentioned earlier that the major standard setters, GRIs, the SASB, et cetera, have come together because they know that the industry is having trouble. Like, do I do GRI? Do I do SASB? On the investor side, it's very interesting to see what investors are doing. So BlackRock's very famous in this space. The Larry Fink letter saying, we all must, take this sort of seriously. But more locally in Asia, the sort of BlackRock here have been actually writing to all the companies that they invest in saying, you have to align to SASB. Send us that, or you won't get funded. So, there's lots of different angles here, and everyone has to play their part, But on that side, so just on that regulatory change, and even with the stuff coming from the European Commission, it's quite interesting on their ambition, which is great. So if you haven't looked at it, look at the EU Action Plan. But they're addressing the problems that gave us sort of the false dawn in the 2000s, the greenwashing. There's no standards and labels. There was no taxonomies back then, and that's coming out. So taxonomies are coming through. Malaysia and China and Asia have been progressing taxonomies. And what they are taxonomies of economic activity. So how much do they align to particular principles? The first two are around climate adaptation and mitigation. And do they do it? I don't think any of us can hit it, but is there. So, we're seeing a lot of really supportive movement from governments, which I think's extremely positive. And if you look at this, there is no way you could think that this is going away. And, you know, if you're an investor and asset manager, you should be hiring. You need to scale up in this sector.
Thanks, Julia. And I see actually a question from the audience which relates to this as well. And the question goes, how does an investor analyze and differentiate when there's no real standard for data dissemination by regulators and therefore companies? So I think that goes back to perhaps some of the thoughts you shared on disclosure, but do you want to maybe add to that?
I think I've touched on most of it, but you know, this has to come in. The next one will be, and what some countries are grappling with, is what they do with their financial sector. So what should the banks be doing in their lending portfolio? Now that's pretty tricky, you know, which will also, when they crack that nut, it will be, what funding do you get? So the Bank of England has done a lot of great work in this space in terms of like green mortgages. And so we have a really good example which could come into different countries. So you get a better rate based on how sustainable you are. You get a pretty poor rate, you know, if you're doing some brown activities. And so that's definitely the future. There'll be different funding. You will see this coming through. It's already in consultation in many, many countries. And that affects your portfolio. So if you are an investor, you know, and especially a long-term one, your profitability will be hit in the long term. So you have to take these into consideration. But that data, you know, that data piece is getting worked on. And so at a more macro piece, you've got IOSCO and the NGFS that have both launched data gap working groups to solve a lot of these issues. So we launched this Future of Sustainable Data Alliance to look at this issue. We'll get through it. You know, there'll be quite a lot of progress by the next year in this space globally.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe if I can chime in from the reporter's perspective, you know, it has not been easy. We have already published 13 sustainability reports, 13 years. And of course, 3 years ago, our stock exchange made it, you know, mandatory reporting, report or explain. So it is literally more like a mandatory reporting for listed company on the Singapore Stock Exchange, which is really can really drive the attention of, like, you know, listed companies to look at sustainability, ESG integration more seriously. For us, we actually over the years we have learned to, you know, we use GRI as a core because of the multi, you know, stakeholder approach and materiality. And we over the years we have embraced IRC approach, making business and financial sense of ESG. And we also incorporated, you know, SDG using the SDG compass and, you know, the 10 principle of UNGC as a benchmark, and of course TCFD and the latest with the SBTI. And this year we actually have embraced SASB, the real estate specific standard, into this our own blended reporting framework, which actually it goes very well with the other, you know, the 12 sustainability rating and rankings that we are on, including GRESB, CDP, and the MSCI Dow Jones and the FTSE, etc. So I think that help us to, you know, adopting more international, you know, framework, help us to communicate with, you know, global investors wherever they are located. So I think that is something that we believe in. And when we issued the green bond in 2017, that was the first Singapore companies to issue a green bond. It's also, we adopted a green bond principle, and we have the second, you know, second opinion provider and also third party framework, and then we sent to a climate bond initiative to endorse on it. So all these actually help us to really communicate with the international investor, the bond, you know, subscribers and all that. So last year we actually launched the SDG innovation loan, which is something that we actually partner with the local bank, the DBS here in Singapore, and we came up with this strategy, is that how do we combine innovation and also serving SDG, really innovate to do good. And the framework we adopted is also, you know, adopting the based on the green bond framework, principle framework, and plus also referred to social bond principle as well. And basically there is a discount elements come with this sustainable SDG innovation loan. If we can come up with this innovation that can serve good causes, you know, among SDG, whether it is climate action or social causes, there will be a you know, a little discount come with it. So that is actually to drive the the agenda of like innovate for good, to serve social and environmental causes. So that's how we actually embrace SDG from a business perspective, from a private sector perspective, and from the our monetary authority in Singapore also launched a $2 billion program to promote green bond, and and also recently also release guideline for responsible banking. So I think the regulators are working hard on that. I mean, in Singapore, I could only say for that. And then public sector, private sectors are working hand in hand in this. And I think SDG is really, provided this driver for us to really look at, social development and sustainable development on the common ground, and contribute in our own way, whether it's the public, private, or people sector.
Thank you, Esther. It's a great case study, I think, for all of us on the line to really learn from. I think I see another question from the audience, and I wanted to ask you, Guillaume, this question. What role can public governance play in ensuring the SDGs are achieved?
Yeah, thank you, Trang. And I will answer this question. Let me just go back to a few points that were raised earlier. And I'm also, an optimistic, and I think obviously, there's a crucial role for the businesses to play here, and the investment community as well, to help us get back on track on the SDGs. But I also think that the failures so far in getting on track for achieving these goals is also due to fragmented international leadership, and that we do need stronger public policies, long-term plans to help drive those changes and lead again to new forms of public-private partnerships, but also new regulations on when it comes to sustainable investments. And I completely agree with Julia that on a lot of these things, the EU is probably a step ahead of many parts of the world with the European Green Deal, but also the taxonomy and some of the regulations that the EU has put in place. I also see on the business side of things lots of progress since 2015 in translating those goals, which were again adopted originally for countries, for UN member states, into the business community. But also in aligning the reporting and some of the corporate benchmarks also to the achievement of the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement. And I think here, some of the work obviously done by the UN Global Compact, but also work done by the World Benchmarking Alliance or the World Business Council on Sustainable Development are really at the forefront of some of those efforts to align corporate reporting and benchmarks to the SDGs. To the question on the role of public governance, I think right now, there is an opportunity to accelerate some of these transformations through public investment. And I think here, if we take, I'm an economist, so I'll go back to the GDP formula. But if we take the GDP formula, we know, we have aggregate demand, we have private investment income, and then we have trade and public investment. We know that aggregate demand will remain low in the medium run because of the uncertainties. We also know that private investment, even though it's starting to pick up a little bit, it will remain relatively low. In normal times, it's 4 or 5 times higher than public investment. But here, there's also lots of things that need to be done in order to help bring back confidence for businesses and for increasing private investment. Then trade will remain disrupted. Global supply chains are disrupted all over. So in the medium term, trade will not be the driver of economic growth. So public investment will basically be the main driver of growth in the next 6 to 18 months. And I think the key question is, what do we do with those massive stimulus packages and investment packages, and how do we make sure that the funds are well spent and aligned to the achievement of the SDGs and Paris Climate Agreement? And I think here there should be 3 priorities, and I think these are pretty well reflected again in what the EU has done with its Next Generation EU program, but also obviously aligning this to the European Green Deal, but also in its long-term budget, the multi-annual financial framework that they have put forward. So I think here there's obviously the need to have public investments that are a recovery that is green, right? So led by investments into renewable energy, but also digital technologies. And here the EU is very big on that side. The recovery also needs to be job-led and inclusive, right? So I think if we focus only on the sustainable environmental dimension and we miss the social part of it, you know, I'm based in France. We have had the yellow vest. I think you do need absolutely to combine this need for sustainable green development, but also taking into account this notion of fair transition. And here there will be a need for investing massively into training, skills, and lifelong learning. So that's the second big pillar. And then the third one is this aspect related to a word that you've used, Trang, is resilience, right? I think here we have seen that pretty much all health systems around the world, except for a few exceptions in the Asia-Pacific regions, had some weaknesses when it comes to dealing with these kinds of global health security issues. And I think more profoundly, there might have been a little bit of an issue, including in OECD countries, for when it comes to strategic foresight and long-term planning. Some things that some governments, again, in the Asia Pacific have probably have some more capacities to do, and are possibly more able to launch these kind of long-term plans and directed change compared to what's happening, for instance, in Western Europe, where over time we have probably lost this ability to really drive long-term directed changes. So those would be, I think, the main priorities for public policies in order to move things forward on the SDGs.
Trang, I'd like to just add another angle to that. Completely agree with what Guillaume's saying, but there's another angle on like fintech and digital finance, and so it's extremely important. So one, there's the opportunity that digital finance, fintech, all these new technologies bring. So, you know, if you look at it from even a government point of view, if you move to an e-government and you digitize it, you have, you know, an electronic KYC system, digital identity for all. You can do electronic payments. Now, the case in India, they actually managed to save 9 billion by digitizing social protection payments because it wasn't lost to corruption. So there's a lot of these opportunities where we can sort of save money by preventing leakages in the financial system. We know that sort of, you know, money laundering from illicit trade and you know, financing sort of terrorist acts is about 2 trillion a year. So that money is just lost, and a lot of that money could have gone to infrastructure. It could have gone to schools, but it's gone into someone else's coffers. And so, you know, within public procurement and governance, you need to have a lot of these protections in place. And the best way you can do it is actually having the whole government, you know, digitized. And I think that's what we've seen. So, you know, many people will say that, you know, the last 6 months we've sort of progressed, you know, sort of 10 years, you know, we've all gone digital. You know, everyone has to be able to figure out how to do money transfers on their phones. You know, things are changing, and that's an opportunity. And so, you know, there's a huge opportunity ahead of us to harness the power of digital transformation for the SDGs. And we've been a part of a UN task force on this, which was the UN task force of digital financing of the SDGs. We published a report on that about a month ago. And essentially that whole, it's a very big paper, but, you know, this key concepts is how do you put citizens back in the center? You know, over the last X years, citizens have sort of lost connection to the financial system. They don't really get it. It's sort of this big beast out there, but how do we sort of take control? And we can do that via, you know, the opportunities that are ahead of us. We can digitize, we can use a lot of the technologies that are coming in to actually take hold of it and also, you know, prevent all these leakages. You know, case in point with COVID, you know, if you were sort of set up, you could get money directly into your bank account. So there's huge opportunities that that are ahead of us. In my book, I also talk about law reform. So we need to look about SMEs. So the SME sector, many laws, and in particular security laws, are not in favor of them. So how do they capital raise? You know, how do we enable smaller businesses to do more? How do you enable communities to do more? Digitization does help that, and it does prevent those leakages. And so government policies that supports that, and we're seeing, you know, that hugely here in Singapore on sort of fintech, but more broadly around the world, does generate huge opportunity. So it's not all just about sustainability, it's about how you structure the rest of your society as well.
Yeah, I think totally agree with you. If I can just add on to, we have we started conducting materiality issues since 2014. And interestingly, from 2017 onwards, the top ESG issues are no longer just like governance, risk management, it's innovation. So it just shows that our stakeholders are looking at long term, looking at innovation as the key ESG issue to actually contribute to the overall ESG performance. So as an investor ourselves, we have been actually investing in, prop tech, like what you talk about, technology, digitalization. Without that, you and I will not be even talking now. So it's also a matter of business continuity. If you have no, technology support, no IoT support and all that, you will never be able to, continue your business. And digitalization is very important, especially, how it has helped us to trace our people, how do we, do tracking of people in and out and, and communicate, effectively to contain the virus spread of COVID. It has been really, really important. So for us, we also invest in like technology, companies and groups, such as the Fifth Wall, and also like Pupil and Gush, which actually looking at air purifying paints and all that. So health and safety are very, very important. Without technology, it's very hard for us to make the quantum leap. And we even have like set up innovation for SDG with UNDP and our local government, that support social enterprises. Basically, we support rent-free space for social enterprises that's aligned with, SDG. So there are a lot of, opportunities for partnership, whether it is with UN agency, with government, with private sector and people sector. So basically, the innovation is key for us to drive SDG forward, especially in the developing, economy.
Thanks, Esther. And yeah, I think great insight shared by all three of you. And I'm conscious of timing, so I think we should wrap up soon. But I think there's a $1 million question in my head, and I think you all are quite optimistic. But if you could just answer maybe the yes or no, do you think we can achieve the SDGs by 2030?
Yes.
Yes, we have to make it happen. Yeah.
It's going to be a hard slog. But it is, think about it, creating the world we want. Do we really not want to achieve it? We really have to focus on its achievement. And you must look at Guillaume's SDSN SDG Compass and the SDG Index. It's brilliant. If you want to see where countries are at, I adore it. I like going in there going, okay, right, this country needs to do this. We have this data, use it. Transform. It's up to us to make it happen.
Trang, I followed very strictly your question and answered with just a straight yes, but let me just add one word to this. So Julia is referring to this report that we do annually, the Sustainable Development Report, which tracks the performance of all UN member states on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The last edition was launched in June. And just really to your question, we actually released a piece a few weeks ago, which was published in as a Nature editorial, which was entitled Speaking Truth to Power, and where we're basically answering to this question: are the SDGs achievable? Technically, they are. They are also affordable. The real question is, are we going to have the right leadership for achieving those goals by 2030? But I think it's the role. We are networks of scientists, researchers mobilized around the SDGs, and I think it's the role of research and science to continue to speak truth to power about the feasibility and the affordability of this agenda.
Thanks all of you. I think that's a great way, I think, to end. So once again, a massive thank you to Julia, Esther, and Guillaume for your time today. I wish we could continue longer, but yeah, I appreciate your thoughts and insights shared. I think really it comes down to the fact that the SDGs are affordable, they are possible, we have the data, but it's really boiling down to leadership, to governance, to really looking at a more sustainable and inclusive recovery post-COVID-19. So thank you again. And I think I wanted to actually just use an opportunity to bring up a QR code. I think my colleague will be pushing it up. If for those who want to learn more about the topic of SDGs and sustainability, as I think Julia mentioned, we've launched a report on the role of data and sustainable investment in regulation and policy, and we'll provide this link in the chat if you want to kind of find out more. And I think we can also share the link to the SDG index that was referenced at the end of our conversation. So as always, do follow our social media channels, and I look forward to seeing you online soon again. Until then, take care.